In this video, we want to take a look at the third set of readings from the Gospel of Matthew, and that is Matthew chapters 15 through 21. We're kind of in the middle section of Matthew here, and so some wonderful accounts and stories. Begins in chapter 15 with some conversation about the scribes and the Pharisees. And then on verse 10 in chapter 15, there's a very important story. Jesus asks the people what is it that defiles a person? And he says it's not what goes into the mouth that defiles a person. Now, in the Old Testament, there were all sorts of religious laws about what a person ate and what a person could not eat. And you were defiled if you ate something that you shouldn't eat. So Jesus is going to refine and change that statute here. Jesus replies and says, he said, "Do you not see that whatever goes into the mouth passes into the stomach and is expelled? But what comes out of the mouth proceeds from the heart, and this defiles a person. For out of the heart comes evil thoughts, murder, adultery, sexual immorality, theft, false witness, slander. These are what defile a person, but to eat with unwashed hands does not defile a person." So this is a very important statement by here. He's really changing the way people of faith are to look at things. It's not what goes into our stomach that defiles us, but rather it's what comes out of our hearts. So at the end of chapter 15, we have a story about Jesus feeding 4,000 people. You might remember that Jesus previously fed a crowd of 5,000. This was 5,000 men in addition to women and children, so it could have been twice that large. Here the same thing, except it's 4,000, so this is a different incident. So these are stories in which Jesus is illustrating what he says on the Sermon on the Mount. In the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 6:33, he says, "Seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and everything else you need will be added to you as a matter of course." Well, here's a group of people that have spent all day listening to Jesus. They need to get home, but they have no food for the journey, and Jesus provides that food for them. So he illustrates that those who seek after the kingdom of God will have what they need provided for them. Now, chapter 16, more about the scribes and Pharisees. They were a religious group, and Jesus is going to help the people to see that some of their problems and issues. Middle of that section, we have what's called the confession of Peter. Confession does not mean confessing his sins, but the confession of faith in Jesus, the acknowledgement that Jesus is the Christ. And so Jesus says to the disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" And then he says to the disciples, "But who do you say that I am?" And Peter is going to answer for the group, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God," and Jesus will commend him for that. So this is the moment in which Jesus finally acknowledges to the disciples, somewhat publicly, although just in that little private group, that he is in fact the Messiah. He is the Son of God who's come and for the purposes of saving and redeeming the nation. However, what happens right after that is that Jesus is going to begin to instruct the disciples and talk to them about what that means. And what that means is that he is going to suffer and go to the cross and be killed, but rise again after that. The disciples have no idea what that means, but Jesus begins to raise the question, raise the issue, the specter that they should not expect a glorious kingdom, a renewal of the nation in the way that they may have thought. Chapter 17, the transfiguration. Jesus takes Peter and James and John up on a mountain. He's transfigured. They see his heavenly glory. That's important for them. And what's really important is that he's with Moses, who represents the law. He's with Elijah, who represents the prophets. A voice comes from heaven and says, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I well pleased. Listen to him." And when the disciples look up, Moses and Elijah are gone, and Jesus is the only one left. So that's an important message for the disciples that even more than Moses in the law, even more than the prophets, Jesus is the one to whom they are to listen. And that's a message for the new church as it begins. Now, chapter 18, a number of different parables: parable of the lost sheep, parable of the unforgiving servant, wonderful parable at the end of chapter 18, which reminds us that we must forgive. And why must we forgive? Well, because we forgive other people the small amount that they have done against us, but God has forgiven us the tremendous debt that we owe to Him, and because God has forgiven us a tremendous debt, we should forgive others for the small things they may have done to us. Chapter 19, very poignant parable about the rich young man who comes to Jesus, and he's wealthy, and Jesus invites him. I think what's going on here is Jesus invites him to become one of his close followers. But to do that, he would and to fit in with the group, he would have to let go of everything that he has. And but he's rich, and he's unable to do that. Well, so not to take this too long, chapter 21 is the story of the triumphal entry, Palm Sunday. So chapter 21 begins the account of the telling of what happens on Holy Week, and that begins on Sunday. And we'll look at that in our next video. So enjoy the reading, read slowly, linger over the passages, and trust that God will speak to you in your reading.